Hey, this episode is brought to you in part by Signature Doors and Windows. Now, onto the show.
Well, I told you the answer to this question earlier, which is I'm a lovable goober with lots of hair who likes to draw and work in architecture and share that with other people.
Hi. Hello.
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 Hello and welcome to Architecting.
Hey, Becca. How you doing?
Doing okay. A little tired.
Yeah, we have both been teaching 2 high school architecture camps in the last 2 weeks, one for ACE and one for Architecture in the City, both hosted through CU. And feeling a little stretched, a little pulled in different directions, huh?
Yeah, it's been fun and equally exhausting, but also fun.
This is your first teaching experience, right?
It is, yeah. It's like just enough. I don't think I need any more.
Well, speaking of someone who has a lot more, that brings us to our guest today, a very fine teacher and a teaching mentor of mine, who was the coordinator when I first started teaching at CU. So we have KEVIN HIRTH here.
Woohoo!
Long time coming. He should have been on a while ago. But this is a guy very accomplished. So he won a lot of awards at University of Virginia for his undergrad and then at Harvard for his grad school. He received the Architectural League Prize in 2017, a big deal, and then just received one of the few Architect Magazine Progressive Architecture Awards given out this year. But above all, I'd say he's just a rock within CU Denver's architecture department and in our community as it's seen nationally. So,
wow,
yeah, he's cool. But this was a pretty unique event. This was way back in the spring, but this was a live event open to the public, a live recording. It was in a pretty cool room. It felt good. It was a good environment to be in, but it was a very bad room. It turned out to record a podcast. There was like a cracked window and like wind gets in and police sirens and all those things that I care about and Becca is rolling her eyes at me for. But the audio quality isn't great, so sorry. But this was a fun conversation with a friend and a colleague that I respect and a rising voice within our profession nationally. So we were able to talk through kind of stuff about his life, and then we took questions from the audience made up mostly of students, but also the dean was there as well from CU.
Nice.
Yeah.
Cool. I'm excited.
So here it is. Enjoy. Hey, so today we have Michael Quinn from Forum Kitchens on. Look, we all have kitchens. Most all of us want better kitchens. Michael, why should we get Forum Kitchens?
I think what you said was sort of the epiphany for our CEO. We all want better kitchens, right? And he grew up doing it as a family business. And then as an adult, he saw the beautiful, stunning kitchens we all see on Pinterest and Instagram and basically tried to put one together himself and just couldn't find that aesthetic at a great price point and wondered why the process was so inefficient and so manual. He thought, well, if I'm seeing these online, why can't I just order them online? And so that's really the idea behind Forum Kitchens, is not only to design and deliver beautiful, stunning, modern kitchens, but to wrap the whole design process in a really modern context. So we design all online. We've built our own software that powers the experience, and it's all really about streamlining and simplifying high-end design, and then through a direct-to-consumer model, really just making it more affordable and more accessible.
Yeah. The great thing is that Michael is here in Denver, so you can reach out to him as well. And if you're looking for more information, we have a special link for the podcast. You can go to social.forumkitchens.com/architecting. Thanks for the partnership, Michael.
Thanks, Adam. Really cool what you've created over at Architecting. We're excited to start to be a part of the community. And like you said, never hesitate to reach out. I love grabbing coffee, and you can shoot me a note at michael@forumkitchens.com.
Perfect. Thanks. Hey, we're happy to be sponsored by Modern in Denver Magazine. For over a decade, they've been crafting fantastically curated content on Colorado designers and projects, spreading the gospel of good design within our region.
And I love how the goal of Modern in Denver aligns with the goal of this podcast, to better build up and connect the community of Colorado designers. So go buy a copy of the magazine at your local bookstand, subscribe to their weekly email list, and follow them on Instagram.
Check it out.
Thanks for coming, Kevin. Thanks for coming to your home here.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. It's funny. You were like one of the first people I reached out to. Like, it's like emailed a few times for lunch, and you never got back to me for a while. And then we finally got lunch. But it's kind of just been a beginning of a pattern where I always reach out to you, and then you take a while to get back. And
No. I'm not even busy.
You're super busy.
I am pretty busy.
That and that's like this nice natural beginning to the podcast, and I'm gonna stop it really hard with the super weird question of who are you?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's like your neck like hurts from the abrupt transition.
Okay, I can be not ready for that.
So if I gave you two sentences, like a part T sketch, who are you?
Okay, all right. Well, I mean, I told you the answer to this question earlier, which is I'm a lovable goober with lots of hair who likes to draw and work in architecture and share that with other people.
Nice.
Yeah.
I think you're like one of the most complete architects I know in the sense of identity, where I don't know anybody who like dresses more like their drawing style. I think you have a very distinct, beautiful drawing style, and I've always been impressed by this sort of like black grayness that you dress in, and sort of this refined frumpiness.
Yes, thank you.
Which is
refined,
like,
frumpy. TM.
You could add that into your about.
Yeah.
But so where did that come from? Like, where'd you grow up?
Well, actually, I grew up on the East Coast in the South, where there's a very kind of homogenous fashion culture for people who are in their youth, I think. And so you either fit into that or bucket altogether. And
what is that? Is that like
it's like
the
a preppy,
the blue, pink polos and
like a rugby shirt and some khaki pants and boat shoes or whatever, which is great. And you know, I think I learned that I didn't want to be necessarily the way everyone else was looking, and then from there, wound up adopting it completely when I moved away from the South. Like I moved to Boston, where everyone was dressing in like all black, you know, with the sort of black Levi's and the black T-shirt, and you know, the very complete appearance. And so I left the South and left that kind of like preppy identity behind, but then fully kind of like adopted this like weird like hipster prep identity because I didn't want to be wearing all black like everyone else.
The architect.
Yeah.
But what you know, it's easy to kind of adopt what's around you in some ways, right? Until something snaps you into wanting to be something else. Like even when you were you're in Virginia, is that where you grew up?
That's right.
Like, were your parents or someone around you doing something different that made you want to kind of go towards architecture?
Not really. My parents are both from the Midwest, so they were kind of from outside of the context that I grew up in as well. And I'll be honest, I went into architecture because my middle school art teacher told me I would never be an artist, basically, and suggested that I try a drafting class in high school because my desire to do art was apparently misguided in her eyes. But I think that honestly, the kind of identity that I've crafted for myself is in a part a sort of attempt to maintain some sense of authenticity for who I am and where it comes from within position of my work. And I actually think that's like kind of a worldview that I espouse to every corner of my identity in a lot of ways, is to sort of adopt this kind of ethical standard for myself that if I'm not doing something that reinforces my project and my identity, then I'm probably veering away from the core set of values that I set for myself. And really a lot of those things, I mean, we talked about like where I grew up and the kind of upbringing or whatever, they don't bear too much on how I view myself today, beyond the sense that it informed my appreciation maybe for like the natural environment and being outside, basically.
Like where you grew up didn't necessarily influence that architectural project.
No,
but it got you there. Like,
yeah.
And I think, I mean, I'm really interested in the idea of the project. Like, it's something I struggle with all the time. I will get there, but I think so. Sticking with the background a little bit. So you're in Virginia. There's a lot of architecture schools around. How'd you end up at UVA? What was that choice like?
That's a good question, and it's kind of a funny one because it's not actually where I wanted to go initially. I was pretty enamored with the Auburn design build program at the time. I had worked in an office where someone had gone through that. They were really encouraging me to basically get out of Virginia, which I was fully on board with. And so I went down there. I got into Auburn. I was very excited to go there. I got into their honors program, which, I was an okay student, but not that great. So it felt like a good thing. But at the time, my mom was not well. She got sick when I was in school. And so it became pretty clear that being closer to home would be good for me, even though it's not necessarily what I wanted. And I was actually thinking about this the other day. Like I was the kind of college student who still hung out with his high school friends, I think, because there were so many of them who went to Virginia.
Oh, yeah.
Don't get me wrong. That's an incredible school. It was probably the best university I got into at the same time. I think my perspective in that moment was almost hedging. Also, like, what if architecture doesn't work? I want to be in a school where like I can try something else and feel like those avenues would open up.
Yeah.
It was just happenstance, honestly, that I wound up at a program that was at a really strong moment in the early 2000s in a class with some incredibly talented designers who I still talk to monthly and respect their work. So in that way, it was kind of good fortune.
It's so influential, like especially when you go to the state school that you are from, right?
Yeah.
That who you end up with and how it sets you off in a direction.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the program there still really emphasized drawing quite heavily. It was one of the last programs that I think carried that through the curriculum pretty deep into the studio sequence, even if it was pushing this kind of hybrid methodology that was pretty in vogue at the time. And actually, that while I would never teach that way today,
as he looks out at his students that are watching us,
it did raise an appreciation in myself for seeing drawing as an act, not as like almost a performative act, as much as it is a form of representation or an outcome of a process. So that was just like sort of
a performative act in what sense?
A drawing to me is something that has to be authored. So lines have to be placed on a page at some level, even if it's being translated through a printer or whatever other device, screen. but that you're sort of authoring the content in a more intentional way than, say, filtering or collaging or something like that.
You know, I always hear that and say that, right? Like drawing is an act of architecture,
Right.
where the drawing becomes the architecture in some ways. I say that to students, and I don't fully understand it myself.
Yeah.
But that, you know, I see it in a way of, okay, if these things are never built, then the architecture is only as good as the drawings that represent it.
That's
in some
interesting.
ways.
Yeah.
You know, that's one take on it. Or the other way of like what you're talking about, of just that sort of architecture as an intentional placing of elements to create architecture in the same way that your intentionality with drawing, right?
Yeah, that
And
makes
that's kind
sense.
of more what you're.
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, like the fundamental act of architecture is drawing. Like it's sort of the thing that we do best, and the thing that, well, in my opinion, and the thing that we are trained to do most heavily, and is sort of the ultimate product of our work that gets passed off to someone else who's like paying for it, basically.
Yeah.
And I think that evaluating yourself through that lens as an architect can be valuable, even though perhaps our emphasis is more on building at the end of the day. To take pride in the product of your work as something that that has a certain format and has a certain like set of rules that you're operating within. Can be kind of fun.
And ultimately, your product is a contract set of documents that you're putting out there. You know, that's what
Right.
you're giving, and you're advising on the construction of a building, but you're not building it. I mean, in most cases, right?
Right. Now, some people do, but
True.
and actually, most of the work I've built have been self-authored at some level. But
Yeah. So you were pretty well instilled with that sensibility, and that sort of went throughout the school, you think? Did you gain that there, or was it sort of a germ of it at UVA?
I think it was, honestly, this is going to sound funny, but it was initially for me germinated in like these goofy drafting classes that I took in high school, where we would have like it was like maybe like a 90s thing, but like they had timed competitions for drafting like a building. So we would show up in like the mall on a Wednesday morning, and there'd be like banks of computers everywhere, and they'd say like, okay, you have 20 minutes, like make the best plan for a building that you can. It was really strange. And so like for me, that was not necessarily an education in drafting or in architecture so much as it was like in developing a twitchy mindset of focus, where you extend past the kind of act of placing an individual line, but get into this sort of like active act that transcends like an individual button on the keyboard. Do you know what I mean by
Like,
that? There's
like 20 minutes to
you get in
figure
the
out
zone.
where the Chick-fil-A goes.
Right,
yeah.
So, and I've always loved that. I mean, that's the thing that I still value the most if I'm working on a project, is like putting on headphones and being like, okay, timer, I have like 4 hours until it's time to pack up. I'm going to just get into the zone, put on like the same song on repeat.
It's 2 a.m. I have 4 hours.
Yeah.
Let's do this.
I find like Philip Glass's Glassworks is really good for this, actually, because it's like so repetitive and almost like terrible sounding on some level.
Yeah.
Like it can be a little shrieky at times. And so like if you put it on, it just becomes this like trance almost where you can just be working and thinking. And that's always been, and I think it shows in my work quite a bit actually, that like there's not a singularity of labor so much as like the accumulation of vast amounts of labor that then gets put together into something that's almost expository.
Yeah. In a little bit of that like dissonance in a way. The sort of repetitive and the screechy. nice screechy.
Yeah. Pleasantly screechy.
Pleasantly screechy.
Or maybe like intentionally unpleasantly screechy.
So you left. I feel like that's always such an interesting period when you graduate from undergrad from architecture and you've gone through boot camp and then you spit out in the world, and it's either super hard to keep that sort of momentum going or to figure out what's next. So what was next?
Well, so I actually I got out of my BS Art program, which is a 4-year degree. And I worked for a landscape architect in Virginia named Greg Bleem. He's an incredible, from the Dan Kiley tradition of modern landscape architects, designer who's practiced all over the East Coast for years and years now. It was a really attractive position for me because he was working with a lot of architects who I was interested in. So I got to kind of float in and out of like maybe 3 or 4 dozen projects over 2 years that were being done by like Toshiko Mori or Yoshio Taniguchi or W.G. Clark, like people who were at that moment at least, and still continue to be sort of resonant within the East Coast, the Central East Coast scene. Which was great. It was a good project management experience as well. Like I spent a lot of time on the phone with contractors and things like that. But honestly, the greatest byproduct of it was spending time with Greg's enormous architecture library, which became for me, like I'll be honest, I was not a model architectural history student in college.
That's interesting.
But I would sit down with one of his books every day, like say a Barragan book, having very little, if any, knowledge about Barragan to begin with, and I would just spend, my lunch break just staring at a book and then pick another one up. He probably had 2,000 or 3,000 books in his library. So for me, that was like almost a second education, starting to evaluate precedent and in particular like a kind of 20th century, an understanding of 20th century architectural history that wasn't necessarily emphasized to me previously, that began to help fill in the kind of like line of time that we're in, which to me is still enormously foundational to working today. So.
That's really interesting because I saw that on your resume of working. That's almost like the longest place you've worked, right?
Yeah.
For a landscape architect, and the sort of choice there and what you got from it, That's interesting to think about how you were so adjacent to so much architecture, and I guess figuring out how to integrate in, and then sort of like maybe a little bit of the southern landscape in general, right? Like still.
Yeah. Well, and honestly, in a practice like Greg's, it was very much about detailing, architectural detailing at the kind of intermediate to small scale. So like handrails and fences. Stairs and walls. That's really where he focuses heavily, which to me, if I had attempted to think about that before I took that job, I would have probably had a fairly general approach of thinking about like, where's a good stair that I've seen before? Let's try to think about how to do something new. But working in his office really, like we would do full scale one-to-one mock-ups and spend a day building out of foam like stairs and things like that. Gave me a different appreciation for working a little more in conflict with what I was saying a minute ago about like just being really fast, being like almost obnoxiously slow and taking an enormous amount of time to study small moments that you're studying in a way to try to create something unique. If you do 10 stairs a year for 30 years, like Greg probably does, at a certain point, you don't just do the same stair, you'd go crazy.
Yeah.
So there's a kind of constant sense of reinvention and exploration within the detail that I don't think an architect can always be afforded to take in the same sense that a landscape architect operating at his level was able to get into. When your scope is restricted to just 20 elements,
right.
And you're not worried about assemblies and waterproofing, it changes the kind of focus a little bit.
Yeah.
For what it's worth, I know nothing about plants. I learned nothing about plants. I would be like, Greg, what do you think about like a fuzzy green thing? He'd be like, okay, Kevin.
stay in your lane.
Yeah.
Go back to the
Go back to the drawing board.
So was there a point where you could see yourself staying in that world, or
No.
was it always there's always a limit to it?
There was always a limit to it, and it was for me. It was a great opportunity. I got to work with and be in the room with a lot of different people, and I kind of saw that as a moment where I could have a very diverse training in a short period of time, but that when I stepped on from it, I could carry on the tools that I had learned there, which I think I do. I think architects are not necessarily very good landscape designers, as we've seen time and again, and I've actually come to really greatly appreciate that discipline for the different type of scale that it has to work in. But it's not one that I've really thought I would linger in.
And so then, was that a pretty clear path for you to the GSD or to grad school in general?
Yeah. So I took 2 years between my 2 degree programs. And the second year, really, I was working full time and being a 23-year-old full time, but then also working on my portfolio every day, basically. Like I did 2 new projects. And in some ways, I see that as like a foundational moment of seeing architecture as not something that's assigned to you, but something that you can interface with and start to assign yourself in a way and then contribute to. So like in doing a couple of competitions and redoing a project and reworking drawings and getting everything into that. At that time, it was still a print portfolio submission, which is long gone at this point. But like even the act of putting the book together was like kind of a month-long project of like hand stitching and things like that. So that was fun, but it was all a vehicle to get to graduate school, which is really where I think like my adult life began, probably.
Yeah. And why the GSD?
I was completely enamored with and fascinated with the design culture there. It was also a pretty interesting moment of transition within the program. I was going in at Preston Scott Cohen's first year as chair, or maybe his second year, and then Boyson, his term as the dean. So that it felt like there was an establishment of energy there that was going to continue to grow, and I was kind of curious to see what that would be like.
Was it what you expected when you got there?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
I mean, in some ways, Cambridge is like it's more extra than you can imagine it is on some level, like the sort of Cambridge-ness of it. It's a little bit like Boulder, actually, in the sense that you were describing earlier. It's sort of like, it is kind of, in many ways what you expect it to be. It's like part of Boston, but it's also part of this sort of like intelligentsia culture. The GSD was way more gratifying, actually, than I thought it would be. Like it was a community of people first, whereas going in, I thought it would be kind of a community second or third, and a place to kind of individuate work first. So that was really a nice discovery to kind of stitch into a community that went from not just student to student, but also from faculty to students to build a culture, which I think they have to do there. It's, Cambridge can be a little bit hostile in the winter. And, it's a lot. So I think banding together and having a good community is
huddle around your trays and
yeah, exactly. Well, it's not a great place to be alone too, so you really want to kind of be in that community. So.
Yeah. What influenced you there most, or who influenced you there? Who are some of your people?
Yeah, I had some really great studios. I had a studio with the Grafton architects, Shelley and Yvonne. It was very. It was before they had just finished their Boccioni School in Milan, which was a big deal for them. But before they kind of launched into their current trajectory, where they're winning the Pritzker Prize and things like that.
Yeah.
I loved their methodology and their kind of casual approach to desk grits. But then more directly, I was really lucky to have Max Scoggin as my thesis advisor, and then Toshiko Mori. I was her TA for a short stint and had her for a studio based in Africa, actually, which was kind of a prelude to some of her work in Senegal that was really successful for her. So it was actually, I was lucky to have them as teachers, but also kind of mentors. I still keep in touch with Toshiko and Mac in particular still, which is fun.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know you were with Grafton.
They were at Yale not long after. I don't know.
Oh yeah. I missed them there, but that sort of them and Mac, like there's a bit of that, like that sort of dissonance, that like ordered dissonance that we were talking about before.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that ordered dissonance is a great way of thinking of it. Or I like to think of it also as sort of like generating order and then intentionally disrupting that order in some way, or like problematizing it.
Yeah.
Which, Toshiko would make fun of me in studio. She's that way as well. I remember her very clearly, like kind of ridiculing, like poking fun at me for how like rigid I was. Like, it's a box packing project. Everything is like very efficient and about sort of like putting everything into like a very clean sort of orderly position. And she kept on pushing me. And it wasn't until we actually went to Senegal and I saw how people built there that I realized how, rut I was in a way to be so rigid all the time. And so that was a similarly like get out of your own head kind of moment. But
that's interesting because, you coordinated one of the first studios that I taught here, and we were doing projects sort of along that line. And I remember you coming up to me and be like, you don't have to make it so rigid. So like I was even more rigid than you were. But, so in that same sense of being at UVA and leaving, you get spit out of that nice warm architectural nest at Harvard. Then what happens?
So I stayed in Cambridge. That was at the peak of the economic slide at that point. It was 2010, like in the middle of winter. So I took it, and I was like more than broke. I took out a what's called a grad plus loan, which is not a very favorable loan for those of you who know, just to do my model for my thesis, which I also wouldn't recommend. So I took a job for a former professor in Boston, actually. I stayed in Boston. My wife was just she was moving to Boston to move in with me at that point. So we were both kind of scrambling to find work. It was a good job. I was a design studio leader, so I had a chance to kind of take on leadership role in crafting projects directly underneath the principal, but then also did a lot of project architect and project management tasks, in particular on a school project, which required a lot of like weekly meetings with stakeholders and things like that. So that was kind of trial by fire on standing in a room with a bunch of Boston socialites in Weston, Massachusetts. It's like the top 100 wealthiest towns in the country. And then me standing in front of the room with my like too tight fitting tweed jacket on.
It was still black.
trying to convince everyone to build a roundabout they didn't want.
And where was that at?
That was at Jonathan Levy Architects.
And what got you there?
The job offer, and just wanting to stay in Boston. Jonathan was a professor of mine. He has an interesting practice.
Yeah, it seems like some strong work. I mean,
it is. He's very kind of nested within the Massachusetts dialect and regional culture. So it was a good education. By the end of it, we were ready to leave Boston. I think going to school in Cambridge is a little different from commuting on the Green Line to the Back Bay every day.
Yeah.
And I think by the end of it, we were ready to move on. So we moved out here, which was great.
Why here?
Well, we were we had a short list. It was like New York, back to the Bay Area where my wife had lived for a long time, or Colorado, which my wife has her family has a cabin up in the mountains here. So she kind of dragged me out here on a vacation the summer before. And we were talking about it, and she was like, well, we could live here in this oasis in the mountains. It's like, okay, that sounds pretty good. I'd always loved being outside and hadn't really spent enough time in the West, but was always kind of enamored with it. So it was a bit of a hasty decision, as those things go when you're in your early to mid 20s, to just commit and go for it. And never looked back. It's been great.
What was that story you told me? You had 12 interviews in 24 hours or something when you flew into...
Yeah, that was crazy. So I was we were coming out to meet with prospective employers and just meet people. I had never been to Denver before, only around it from the airport. And so I also wanted to kind of get to know what the city was like. But at that point we had already committed. We were moving to Colorado. So I was kind of more or less sight unseen, Denver, yes, let's do this. And so I was there. I lined up 4 meetings a day for 3 days straight, including a review here and a meeting with Matt Shea, who's in the back over there, as well as and then on the 4th day, I had determined that I was going to propose to my wife. So it was a little bit crazy, but I was driving a rental car around Denver, having hour-and-a-half meetings with people, and then racing across town and meeting with someone else. I actually blew off the 12th meeting, which I won't name names, but I still feel bad, and I've never talked to that person again. But they were kind of okay, fine. I spent that day, actually, I was in the Botanic Gardens, in the kind of heritage modern gardens around I blew off the meeting and sat there and was kind of okay, this has been a lot. I guess I'm going to propose tomorrow. Let's do this. And so we went back up into Evergreen for a picnic, and my wife didn't really know what was going on. And we were sitting down for our picnic. It was in May, and a black bear came around the corner. And so I'm already on edge, very on edge, and a little worn out from hi, I'm Kevin. Nice to meet you. Okay, I gotta go. Let's do it again. And I just freaked out and yelled at the bear.
And then on the back of the bear was a little pillow with one ring, and it came up to you.
Yeah, exactly. It was all planned. No, I kind of caught my breath and proposed within 5 minutes.
But we gotta go.
Yeah. We should leave. So
out of the 11, who won?
That was when I wound up working with Paul Anderson. At the time, his company was Indie Architecture, now Independent Architecture. Really, that's where I wanted to be all along.
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways, I wasn't. This is my advice to my younger crowd in here, or really anyone listening. If you're moving to a new city, I would never approach a meeting with someone with the intent of looking for a job, but rather just meet with them. Right. So it was just a lot of fun, nice meetings. But I walked away. I came to Denver with a job with Paul, which was a great opportunity for me. It was stitching into a practice that has national and international aspirations, and is really experimenting a lot with different forms of practice and forms of putting a project together. And to me, that was in some ways the next education, which was sort of Paul is really excellent at formulating an approach to a practice and seeing what's going on in the world around you, and understanding the kind of niche that you can form that other people aren't necessarily doing that might help to kind of push into a new direction.
Yeah.
I was constantly inspired by the way in which he approached practice, not as sort of a formula to figure out how to do the next thing better than the last thing, but almost saying, okay, we came into work yesterday and what we were doing worked, but let's try it again. And that sort of sense of like restless searching wasn't just like a week to week thing, but like really continuous, which was great. It's good. I mean, it fit into my own like kind of machine like need to just like constantly be producing. Like we would sit down with a small project, like, hey, let's look at, you know, an ADU. We would, you know, Jason King, who's the other person in the office, and he's at Lorcan O'Hurley's office now, would sit down and maybe do like 20, 30, 40 iterations in like a 5-hour period and like throw them back at each other. And
right back at the mall project.
Yeah, exactly. It was like we would crank music really loud and like
Philip Glass,
you'd have to yell at each other. No, that wasn't my like grungy phase. But you know, for anyone who's like tried to come up with a fresh idea after coming up with 20 others, at a certain point, you're not even burning out anymore. You're just sort of like grinding, and it forces a different way of evaluating what you've been doing as like almost it's a search that doesn't really have a correct solution, and so you just keep searching and searching until something comes up, usually failing to do something right but in a good
40
way.
times you have great success. And
it can be frustrating because in some way it's a little paralyzing to figure out whether you've got the right thing or not, but to me that's what's it's exciting.
Where the active critique becomes really important, right? When you have so many options and
absolutely critique and I think like an absolution of ego on some level. Like you're not, when you're authoring that much, that constantly, day to day, over and over again, things become disposable in a very functional and useful way, where you can kind of say like, I spent 3 hours on that. That was terrible. Oh, well, let's do the next thing. Whereas I think when you're working on and focusing on the sort of the fallacy of the like masterful idea, the notion that you maybe didn't make the right decision can be problematic to your sense of self.
And so was teaching always a plan or a part of that, or how did that come in, and then how did full-time teaching go into the experience with Paul?
Honestly, before I was at the GSD, teaching didn't really hold that much appeal for me. I really was pretty dead set on practice as the kind of end-all be-all for what I wanted to do. It wasn't until I really saw how Toshiko and Mac in particular would frame their work through the studio and vice versa, and marrying the kind of academia to practice, I really began to see the incredible leverage and power that you can get from that, where and it's not transactional, I think, in the sense that you might think like, oh, this studio, like you guys think about this idea, I'm trying to think through in my studio. It's more like
you're the ones doing the 40 ideas and Kevin's taking one.
No, it's not that at all. It's more like kind of framing a question and then bringing people together for 6 months to consider that question critically and poke it from a bunch of different directions. The solution in many ways is irrelevant from that as an outcome for practice, so much as a way of thinking about how to frame and reframe a series of questions that you might have that then can inform a whole body of work. Does that make sense? So I would never describe the marriage between academia and practice as transactional in any way, or at least it shouldn't be, so much as like a interrelated as a way of building off of very different strengths. So
But I find that to be, especially in my case of trying to straddle both worlds, right? It's very difficult to kind of have a foot in both worlds, and you made the purposeful choice to go, full
Into
academia,
both, yeah.
well, into both, but at least like you're getting your biggest paycheck from the school, right?
Yeah.
And there's people like Mac or Tertiary, like other people that, it's like in some ways they have this built up as practice, and they're able to kind of do both. But was that a hard choice between saying, okay, I can teach half-time and I can work at a firm half-time versus I need to go full-time into this?
Well, I think what was and continues to be my love affair with teaching is the design research and kind of formulating the research side of my work and the teaching really around the kind of advancement of design. To me has an optimism to it that I can fulfill almost exponentially to being kind of half in to practice and half out. I'm afforded the luxury of not having to take a project that won't advance that research agenda or that creative work. And that can be hard at times. Like I might want to work on an edition or something that is interesting, but I made the choice to really focus around using teaching as a tool to forward a theoretical agenda around architecture as a kind of framework and tool for viewing the world, which I get to draw a lot too, which I obviously get a lot out of. So
right, and I think kind of talking about that, talking about this idea of project, obviously like in 2017, you won the Architectural League New York League Prize, right? And I remember you showing me your application for that, right? And that was the third time or something you had applied.
Yeah.
But it was so full of precedent, right? And of really marrying your projects to precedent and drawing. And that seemed like a sort of like breakthrough for you in a way of putting that together. So maybe I'll get to a question. But the question is, tell me how to be a good architect. And the question is more of, do you feel like you're able to articulate that your project within architecture and in a real sense, and especially through some of these, like through the League Prize and some of these things that you had to kind of pull this together?
I mean, in some ways, applying to the Architectural League Prize is an act of framing to begin with. And I think I applied to it actually 4 times, maybe. Framing and reframing and not winning, which if you ever want to like feel frustration, spend a month on an award submission and don't get it, and then immediately resolve to do it again. But I actually think that's that was an early huge benchmark for me in my career that I'll always look back on fondly, because applying to that prize was an annual, like the month of January, essentially exercise of looking at what I had done over the last couple of years and trying to figure out what pulled it all together and what was the project, which is an intentional act that the league does by putting together prompts every year. It sort of forces you to respond to something maybe asynchronous to what you're typically thinking about. And actually the third year, whatever, the last year I did it, I kind of had decided, like, I don't know that I can do this again. I was kind of doing it last minute too. I was like, okay, like I'll do this, but I'm only gonna give it a week. and I did it, and I sent it off to the printers, and the print came back completely wrong, like incomplete. like I think they maybe even sent the wrong book, if I remember correctly. Someone else's like travel portfolio from Cancun 2017 or whatever.
So that's how you won?
Yeah.
Travel portfolio.
They loved it.
They loved it. Yeah.
So then I wound up being like, okay, this is another setback. Like this is another moment where I can just kind of like not do it. I've spent some time putting together the InDesign file and thinking through it. But then I wound up, buying paper, printing and binding it myself and mailing it off. Or I did that in a day. I think I had like one day to kind of put it all together. And that was the year that I wound up winning, which to me that's like a twofold lesson. One is like never stop trying. Like the PA award that I won this year was, I think I had to look back because I had to pull the receipt for tax purposes or whatever, and it was, I think, the 17th time I applied to that, or the 12th time or something. It was some obscene number of times, but I resolved in that moment when I did win that my instinct was correct, that you can't lose if you keep trying.
Yeah,
you haven't lost if you keep trying, and if you keep trying, you increase your chances of winning.
Yeah.
And if nothing else, it's just, especially for something like an award, a good excuse to continue to think through what you were trying to do with something and rewrite on it and rework it. So then the other lesson there, I think, is that sometimes doing something really fast, like I was, like designing a stair for 3 days is one way to do slow. There are other ways to work slowly, but sometimes you just need to say, I have 4 hours. I told my students this the other day, actually, because they were like, we have 20 drawings to do in 3 days. I was, at some point you also have to be able to say, like, I'm going to give this an hour, and I'm going to give it my best hour that I can give it. But when that's over, it's done, and I'm going to just let that be what it is.
And I'm going to tell my brain I'm giving it a half hour. It actually gets an hour because it's going to take twice as long. But
you tell yourself you're going to give it a half hour. You know it's going to take 2 hours, so you give yourself 4.
Yeah. I mean, I think on that point, two things. The one, that's one reason I really love this podcast, is because it's so easy to see a glossy image or an award or something and say, man, that guy's got to put together that it all works out for them, right?
Yeah.
But to say, no, I applied for 17 times, and like I applied for jobs full year and got 3 interviews, and it's like, it's always a struggle, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it can be. And I think then on the other point of when you're saying, okay, I only give myself an hour or doing things fast, I've also seen the way that you work is like, can be excruciatingly purposely slow and like manual in a weird way. Like what was it, the Monument Project?
Yeah.
Where it's thousands of bricks and you move them by hand digitally, each brick. And I was like, you can make a script for that, or you can make something, right? But it's, for you, it was that act or your very distinct drawing style, right? It's not the easiest way. And I've seen you make your stipple backgrounds that take 3 hours of stippling, and then you're scanning it over and blah, blah, blah. That's also pretty fundamental to the way you work too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think it's in some ways kind of dumb that I do things that way, but like the script thing is a good example, especially coming out of the 2000s and even the last decade, where developing a tool to do the work for you became very fashionable, I think. I saw that as both not the kind of work that I enjoyed doing. Like, I could spend days and days developing a script to do the work for me, but actually there's a kind of inherent inflexibility to working with like a digital workflow that automates the outcome for you, that runs completely counter to my own like predilection towards imperfection and like some of the glitch that starts to occur. Like, I'm not master Rhino modeler by any means. And when I put, say, that Monument model together, or I continue to do work like that where you're moving like every stick or every brick, I find that it probably doesn't take as long as writing an effective script to do the work to begin with, but that there's also like an element of discovery in having to do it manually, where I think that like a good example is the mother-in-law house, the sort of smokestack tower ADU that I did a few years ago, where there are like 8 or 10 models of that with different corner conditions articulated. Right. So they're like that model, the one that's like rendered and drawn, took a week, but there's probably 2 or 3 months worth of other models floating in my Dropbox server somewhere. And it's a sort of like consideration of small moments, like the way 3 or 4 whites of brick come together in different courses. That slowness that's zoomed in on a specific detail that then gets extrapolated through the kind of time that has to go into putting it together. I just find that I guess it comes out of my biography a little bit, but I appreciate that kind of granular detail, and then seeing the kind of outcome of the accumulated labor of putting that all together is not something that you can easily automate. So then maybe people misunderstand that. I'm actually kind of into that someone might be like, oh wow, that's either like, wow, that's a really good Photoshop filter to make that brick look like that, or that block, or maybe, oh, that's like really nifty Python script that he had to do that. Like, I kind of like the ambiguity of someone thinking that like I did something in an hour when it actually took me like 40. But then at the same time,
you're not dealing with billable hours. I can see.
I'm billing myself.
In my head, the billable hours are just tick.
I do actually use like a timekeeping app. Like, goes back to practice. It's like humorous sometimes. Like Photoshop collaging 23 hours. Like, oh. But I don't know. I love that. That's like I glean joy from making something every day, and actually, like, I think that the longer it takes, the greater the accumulated value something takes on. I was even joking with a couple of my students who were in the room the other day about thinking about a drawing as how many lines are within a square inch, and they were like, "Oh wow, I'm gonna just like throw a bunch of trees in there." And like, to me, there's like that's a real value of seeing like. What's the accumulated time that was put into something, and are you doing it in a way that you can really is legible and you can register?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, you have a very distinctive graphic style, and I've sort of seen it, I feel like, develop, where in the beginning, it's made up of all these elements. I don't know where for you that style comes from, but in the beginning I was kind of like, I don't know if I like this, because you can never get that crispness, like when you want the fidelity,
right? It's
hard to get it. I've seen recently, like you've figured out sort of how to do that a little better. So the question is, where did it come from, and how do you see it evolving? Like, do you see it sort of handcuffing you in a way, or how does that evolve?
I've been thinking about that a lot recently. Because, well, for one reason, because of my own inherent constant restlessness, right? Like, if something becomes easy to do, that to me is a signal that I need to do it differently. Like, I need to come up with I need to come up with like a new way that is now that's no longer rote. I guess
I'm sleeping too much.
Yeah,
what's wrong here?
So, I mean, a lot of the early drawings that you're talking about. Were coming out of a fascination with drawing in particular. Like, I think over the last 10 years, there's been a like strong drift away from rendering in general towards model making or collage. And I saw that as an opportunity to try something that maybe wasn't as like hip as what you see as a trend, but to like re-embrace drawing as a fundamental act that has to negotiate the image and the kind of rendered form. So I'm trying to carve out my own like little world within representation that reappraises the drawing and like forwards that as opposed to the model or the collage or the Photoshop kind of montage or whatever. And like I was indicating, that's kind of started to get. I have a few workflows that they take a long time, but they're like I want to do something different, and so I'm actually working on like expanding the scale of the drawings to be like 8 feet by 8 feet, almost like mosaic scale, such that the resolution of the drawings has to jump like tenfold from what I've been working at, which would have been like at a maybe 3x3 or 2x2 format, which is taxing. Like I have a computer that has to work very hard, and it's a good computer, but that means it's the right work is happening, right? Like if it takes me an hour for my like really nice workstation to think through one command to like figure out how to trim one set of lines, then I know like I'm on the right track.
Your line curve. She's working,
so yeah, but I'm kind of trying to lean further into the drawing realm than I have been for the last couple of years, which we'll see how it goes. It's like one of my summer projects that I'm working on.
Well, we're coming up about on an hour here, and we have a good group of students and other people, mostly Kevin's students here, that he required them to come. I mean, he invited them to come.
I told them they could work on their studio projects.
That's true. They're all
they sat here.
Is there any? You've got Kevin here on record. Is there any questions you've been dying to ask him? Any nail him down on something? Anybody?
They have to listen.
Like I said, I can edit out this pause. So. Yeah, I'm like
you mentioned getting out of your own head, and I'm curious if there's any recommendations you have for actually doing that or getting out of your own way.
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. Yeah. I spend a lot of time failing, to be honest, and like being able to see that failure and set it aside is, I think, an effective way to do it. More directly, though, I just try to have multiple pursuits happening at once. Is the most direct answer. Like I don't think I could work on one thing on one project for long periods of time. I need like 4 or 5 or 6 things that I can pick up and put down. So my best method is to literally set whatever you've been working on aside and pick something else up, even if it's like crocheting or something. But I mean, for me, like right now, for instance, I'm working on a physical model that requires a lot of cleanup. So I'm like scrubbing it with sandpaper and playing with it. But then I'm working on a series of drawings, working on a model for a digital model for a project that I'm designing. And I just try to cycle through them as much as I can. Does that help?
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely come back to it though, right?
Yes, always come back. Sometimes an hour later, like I usually know when it's time to go back when I have a feel an itch that I haven't looked at it for a while. Like,
when you're tired of the thing you're working on.
Yeah. It's just a cycle of constant exhaustion.
Come back to it for the 17th time, then he knows. Yeah. Right.
I also take a lot of walks, like as a more or less disciplinary approach. Like I do a nice walk downtown and then up the Cherry Creek bike path. It's like you don't see a lot of architecture students down there. It's like nice and quiet. But that, that's my method. So loud music helps.
Does anybody else want to get out of their seats and walk up here for a question?
I guess, and I don't really know how to articulate it, so maybe we can just talk it out. But I guess first question, you started the conversation talking about your interest in Rural Studio at Auburn. And I'm curious if you've ever been able to like come full circle to that interest in design build.
Yeah, that's I've never thought of that actually. It was in my mind, it was like, well, I'm not going to Auburn. I guess I'm going to Virginia. And then I sort of jumped into that. But if I reflect on it, a lot of the impulses that drew me to a design build program when I was 18 persist today, which is a strong desire to see something enter the world and to have a kind of one person to object relationship with that I think can be difficult as a straight architect at times. So recently, like, I fabricated a mock-up for a project that's still sitting on campus that it took a few months of wrestling with, but I got a lot of gratification from assembling it, experimenting with it, and then seeing it kind of manifest.
Which sort of resulted in your 17th
the
time of the PA
progressive
award,
architecture
of
award.
winning that. I mean,
That's right. I mean,
yeah.
100%. That's a mock-up for that project that I took on myself to do. The client didn't ask me to do it. They were kind of dubious about the concept for the project, but I was dead set on proving that it would work. So that was like a proof of concept that I think no one asked me to do, but that was fundamental to proving the project could work and can work and will work. And so that was great. That was like me just out in the annex with an impact driver and a table saw, like screwing around for 6 months. Much faster would it maybe be the History Colorado Museum exhibit that I put together with the help of Mo, who's in the room, along with Ileana Ramirez and a handful of other students, Emmanuel Sklan. And in that case, it was very fast. And so building it became about as much logistics management as about craft or lack thereof. It's sort of like making something that accepted a roughness. And I think that putting that into the world was hot and sweaty work that I would never take back because of the kind of presence that it had and impact that it can have. So yeah, 100%. I continue to come back to building as a kind of crucible act that still scratches the same itch that I think we're talking about with drawing, where you're and much more directly so, accumulating material through labor into something that has a kind of tangible expression of that. Yeah.
Now, you had two questions, right?
Yeah,
You said one.
Oh, yeah.
So the other is sort of like, do you have any advice for students who, I think this sort of goes back to the conversation of state schools a little bit and the fact that you went to the GSD. Do you have advice for students who maybe are at UCD who have sort of a desire to be involved within the design and theory discussion that maybe you would get more heavily at a school like Yale or the GSD?
I will be honest with you. I don't identify the history theory curriculum that I consumed at the GSD as being even remotely contributory to my own practice today, and I would say that to some of those people, like in a conversation to their face, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
They're all listening right now.
Yeah, I'm sure. This is Eve Blau, if you're listening, I loved your class on phenomenal and literal transparency. However, I don't think about it in relation to my work very often.
However, to your face, I will.
No, but in a lot of ways, and I think the way they do their history theory curriculum at the GSD is informative of a mentality that I would recommend, which is to not think that going into school is teaching you knowledge, but rather teaching you a way of absorbing knowledge and consuming knowledge, which you can get almost in any class. Like for instance, their history theory sequence doesn't try to be comprehensive. They will do like a 6-month sequence on one work, for instance, and you just are like, okay, we've talked about Jim Sterling's dorms for like 3 weeks. Can we move on? But like the CU Denver history theory sequence curriculum at large is really deliberately structured to teach you the tools to become an independent thinker in a way that you may not get at other places. It's an incredible opportunity here to kind of formulate your own voice and feel that there's a sense of independence to do that. Whereas I think at other programs there might be there's a sort of I'm making a hand gesture and I'm not sure how to verbalize. There's a sort of like
it's like a swooping.
It's a swooping
gesture.
Yeah, like there's a freedom to not just the school but also the environment in Denver and in Colorado that I think is embracing entrepreneurialism and kind of individualism that I think is an incredible opportunity. I'm taking advantage of it right now. Just to be in this community doing my own thing is unique, right? So that would be my advice, really, to all of you guys, is to use like a sponge, squeeze every drop you can out of the place with the intent of not trying to learn the way someone else. Not like you don't want to learn the KEVIN project. You want to maybe figure out how I've made my project, but then make your own and really like kind of use the resources this place has, which are pretty considerable to do that.
I mean, I think it's easy to say, okay, that place has a name and that has a prestige to it. They must know the answers, right?
Yeah.
And I think you get to some of those places and you're like, well, they don't know the answers as much as I do or anyone, you know, and maybe there's certain resources or people that are there. But I think like in the way that you maybe learned a lot of your history and theory through a library from a landscape architect,
right?
Like it's about grasping onto resources and especially with the internet, right, where everything's sort of accessible, of trying to plug yourself into to the nooks that you're interested in pursuing. I think, you know, and I do think it is a little bit more difficult here where there's not as many architecture schools around, but we can still sort of access those more dense areas, you know.
Yeah, and this is something I've been thinking a lot about actually in the last few months. It's like, because we do have an incredible resource in Denver, namely the kind of practice community and how diverse the people working within it are. We think of the CU Denver kind of pool as being one thing, but then there's like there's a larger community in Denver that come from all over the place, and this is an incredible, like Adam's podcast is an incredible resource to tap into that body of thought in a way. Honestly, I've been like thinking about like how can I rip off Adam's idea but like do it differently enough that
do it better, but with more time,
like,
spend more time. Yeah,
I think that there are plenty of avenues to continue to try to like reach out to people. And actually, one thing I love about Denver that I don't find to be true in other cities that I've tried is that you can write someone an email, say, hey, can I get coffee with you? And maybe 7 out of 10 times they'll get back to you and get coffee with you and want to know your story and spend that time. I think it comes with being in the Midwest and being in the mountains that we're so far from a lot of other places. Just like you're interested in reaching out to find out what other people are doing, other people are also kind of interested to engage with you. I was pretty surprised when I sent my like 18 emails that 12 people got back to me when I moved here. But a lot of them have been on this podcast. Like I still emailed Joe Montalbano every once in a while. I met with him. He was like the second person. I was still fresh. And so I met with him early. But yeah.
Yeah, I did the same. I mean, I think that's a good piece of advice of just not trying to get jobs, but trying to make connections and make friends and mentors, and it mostly works. Well, we have a question from the Dean.
So Kevin, we've heard a lot about what brought you here to today, but we haven't heard about the future.
Where am I going?
Yes, ideally, could you project into the future what you'd want to be doing, whether it's teaching, research, practice, ripping off Adam's podcast, making another one.
Making a better one, yeah.
Whatever.
That's great. Thanks. Thank you, Nan. in many ways, I feel like the path that I set off on in 2016 when I started on the full-time faculty here is still very much incomplete. Like I have a lot of desire to continue the projects that I'm working on, which is really resolving the Colorado context, determining what it really is, and reflecting on it through design work and through drawing. I am working on a book right now around drawing that examines context as a kind of framework. And of course, me being me, I actually have 3 book projects, not one, that I'm working on. So one of them will go, and the other 2 I'll work on forever. But
one's the Cancun vacation book.
Yes, one will just be a travelogue of some stranger from Blurb. So I'm looking forward to writing more in the next year or so than I have been in the last couple of years. But then continuing to frame creative practice and design practice through my teaching here is just a passion that I can't wait to continue working through. So more of the same, but better. Always better.
Is that what your new podcast is going to be called?
Yeah,
more
of
the same, but better.
I can't stop, so I might as well keep going. I mean, it's the same with my pedagogy to give the students an idea. Like, I think it's pretty common to run a studio maybe 3 times. I recreate a new studio every semester, like from the ground up, and I can't stop. And I think I never will. And I think that's fun. So, I was thinking about it this morning because Adam sent me some pre-prepared, I might ask you this if I need to, questions like, who are you? Where do you see yourself in 5 years?
And I haven't asked a single one of those questions.
I know, which is thank you for that, because I didn't like any of my answers. Or I didn't like, when you get those pre-written questions, you over answer them on some level. But for me, the answer to where are you in the future really is continuing to grow in this community, which I've grown to love so much in CU, Denver, and Colorado, and continuing to kind of draw out my own creative practice, literally and figuratively, into this place, and continue to help it grow.
Yeah.
One thing that I'd love to do more of is engage with some of the practice community around drawings and things like that I know they're doing, and it's sometimes hard to break that kind of barrier from one office to another. But I know, like I was saying, all it takes is an email. So that'll be fun.
Yeah. Well, thanks. I just appreciate your presence here in the school and as especially early on teaching as a mentor and working through and just that energy and drive and passion that you're bringing to the Colorado community. And so thanks for sticking around and for being here, and looking forward to hearing your podcast.
Yeah. Thank you, Adam. Thank you. I wanted to, before we break, I wanted to just reflect on what a great friend you've been to me in Denver as well. It's been fun seeing your growth continue to grow.
Sure. Thank you. You really prepared that one.
Yeah, that was a good one. Great closing remarks. Thanks, Adam.
Thanks, and thanks to everybody who's here in person for this first live interview. So thanks.
You can visit architecting.com, that's architect-ing.com, to see images from this week's guest.
And please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.
Have a great week and keep connecting.
Yo, Alexa, play the Plug podcast. My boy Rudolph enjoys an immersive audio experience. Do you feel me? Ho, ho, ho! With Echo Studio, we can listen to any podcast or song from Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and others. Click the link in this episode description.
Santa, check out my podcast.
Damn, even the Grinch has a podcast. Merry Christmas, ho! Ho ho!